All right, so are you ready to like really use your brain today? Because we are going deep into game theory and ethics,
I am ready.
which is kind of a fascinating combo, right? I feel like when most people think of game theory, they think of like, winning strategies and maybe a little bit about poker or chess.
Yeah, you know,
But it gets really interesting when you bring ethics into the picture.
absolutely. And you know what's interesting is that game theory can help us understand why we even have those concepts like fairness or cooperation in the first place.
Okay, so for our listeners who maybe aren't super familiar with all the ins and outs of game theory,
hmm
can you give us like the crash course version? Like, what are we really talking about when we say game theory?
Yeah, so basically it's a way to study how people make decisions when those outcomes depend not just on their own choices, but on what other people decide to do as well.
Okay.
So, it's like a web of choices and it gets really complex.
Like everybody is influencing everybody else's decisions.
Exactly. Yeah. And so your best move might be constantly changing based on what you think other people are going to do.
So it's not just me sitting here, weighing my own pros and cons list.
Right. It's not just like individual decision making in isolation.
Okay.
And that's really where it's different from something like decision theory.
Gotcha.
Game theory is all about those strategic interactions.
Okay, so then where does ethics fit in?
Right.
So are we like using game theory to predict how people will act in situations, or is it something more than that?
It's both, actually. So on the one hand, we can use game theory to explain things,
Okay.
like how moral norms arise and why certain behaviors persist, like cooperation, which can actually seem counterintuitive at first.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. So give me an example of that.
Okay, so let's look at the classic prisoner's dilemma.
Okay.
So imagine you have two soldiers and they've been captured during a conflict.
Okay.
They're separated, and each of them is given a choice. They can betray their comrade and give information to the enemy, or they can stay silent and hope their comrade does the same.
Okay, so they have to trust each other, basically,
Yeah.
to do the right thing.
Exactly. And so if they both stay silent, they might get off with like a lighter sentence. But if one betrays the other while the other one stays silent,
Wow.
then the betrayer goes free and the silent one faces a really harsh punishment.
Oh, man, that's a tough choice.
Right. So the dilemma is that if you're just thinking from your own self-interest, the most rational choice is actually to betray regardless of what the other person does.
Really? Why is that?
Well, think about it. If they stay silent, you go free by betraying them. And if they betray you, you're still better off betraying them back than getting the worst possible outcome by staying silent.
So no matter what, you should betray.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like the dominant strategy.
Yeah.
But the catch is that if both of them follow that logic, they end up worse off than if they had both cooperated.
Ah, so it's like their individual rationality leads to a bad outcome for both of them.
Exactly. So they both end up in a worse place, and that's where the morality comes in.
Yeah.
Because those soldiers, they might be bound by a code of honor or loyalty or some belief in keeping their word.
You don't want to betray their friend or their unit.
Exactly. And so these moral principles can actually override that self-interested calculation and push them toward cooperation, even when it seems risky.
So morality is like the thing that keeps us from all screwing each other over.
Exactly. It acts as a counterweight to our selfish instincts, and it helps us achieve better outcomes for everybody.
I like that.
And game theory helps us understand that whole dynamic. It shows us how even if everyone is self-interested, these moral norms can emerge
Fascinating.
and persist.
Okay, so you mentioned before there's the explanatory side and then the justificatory side. So tell me about that.
Right. So the justificatory side, this is where philosophers get really into it.
Okay.
They're using game theory to explore whether acting morally is not just good for society, but actually rational from an individual's perspective.
So even if it means maybe like losing out in the short term.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like you're not just a sucker for doing the right thing.
Right.
There are actually benefits to it.
Yeah.
So it's not just about should we be moral, but can we be moral without, being taken advantage of.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so this is called the Reconciliation Project. And one way they're doing this is by using game theory to model the long-term consequences of our actions.
Okay, so it's like thinking about the long game, not just the immediate payoff.
Exactly. And so imagine those soldiers, they're not just facing this one decision. They
Yeah.
might interact over and over again.
Makes sense.
Over time. So building a reputation for trustworthiness and cooperation becomes much more important.
Because if I know you're going to betray me, then I'm not going to trust you next time.
Exactly. And then you miss out on the benefits of cooperation in the future.
Okay, so this is where the Humean strategy comes in, right?
Yeah. So this is the idea that, rational agents will cooperate as long as their partner does the same.
Okay.
But if their partner betrays them, they'll retaliate.
So it's like tit for tat.
Exactly.
You be nice to me, I'll be nice to you.
Exactly. And game theory helps us analyze this kind of strategic thinking. It suggests that in the long run, acting ethically is actually the most rational choice.
Wow. So we've got game theory helping us understand why certain moral norms evolve, and also why it makes sense to act morally even if it's not always easy.
Right.
This is blowing my mind.
And we're just getting started.
Oh, no.
There's so much more to explore.
All right, well, I'm ready. Let's do it.
And, speaking of social contracts, that's another area where game theory can be super helpful.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Like all those classic thinkers like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, they all had these big ideas about how societies work. But I'm curious, how does game theory actually add to all of that?
Well, it gives us a really concrete way to model how people, even if they have totally different goals, can actually come to agree on a set of rules for living together.
It's like a mathematical way of looking at those compromises we make to create a functioning society.
Right. And it can help us analyze different ways of setting up those rules. Like, how do we divide resources fairly? How do we make sure everyone is contributing?
It's like taking those big philosophical questions and making them something we can actually map out and study.
Exactly. And to give you a concrete example, let's imagine two people, we'll call them Alex and Jamie,
Okay.
and they're trying to figure out how to split a cake.
The classic cake dilemma.
Right. So Alex might want to eat the whole thing,
Naturally.
and Jamie might be thinking, let's be fair and split it 50-50.
Right. So you've got this tension between self-interest and fairness.
Exactly. And that's where the Nash bargaining problem comes in.
Okay, I've heard of that, but remind me, what's that all about?
So it's a concept developed by John Nash, and it basically helps us understand how to approach these kinds of negotiations.
Okay.
It takes into account what each person wants, all the possible ways they could split the cake, and then something called the non-agreement point.
The non-agreement point. Okay, now that sounds important. What's that?
So it's basically like the worst case scenario.
Okay.
Like, what happens if Alex and Jamie just can't agree?
So they both end up with no cake.
Exactly. And nobody wants that, right?
That's a bad outcome for everyone.
And that's kind of the leverage they have in the negotiation.
Interesting.
So the Nash bargaining solution tries to find a way to split the cake where both of them are better off than if they had just walked away empty-handed.
So it's like finding that sweet spot where everyone gets something and nobody feels totally cheated.
Exactly. And the really cool thing is that we can apply this same logic to way bigger issues than just splitting a cake.
Like to society as a whole.
Right, to like actual social contracts.
We're all just trying to get a piece of the metaphorical cake.
Exactly. We're all trying to figure out how to live together and get our needs met.
But does game theory always lead to solutions that we would actually consider fair or just?
That's a really good question, and this is where things get more complex. Game theory itself doesn't tell us what's right or wrong. It's a tool for analyzing these strategic interactions, but it doesn't tell us what values we should prioritize.
So it's like it gives us the map, but it doesn't tell us what destination to choose.
Exactly. We need philosophy to help us figure out what our goals should be.
This is really making me think about ethics in a whole new way. And so far we've been talking about rational, self-interested individuals. But what about the role of evolution? How does that fit into this whole picture?
That's a great question, and that brings us to evolutionary game theory.
Okay, evolutionary game theory. So that sounds pretty intense. What is that?
Yeah, it's basically taking those ideas from evolution, like natural selection, and applying them to understand how different strategies and behaviors evolve over time.
Okay.
Even moral behaviors.
So we're not just looking at individuals making decisions in the moment.
Right. It's about how those behaviors play out over generations.
We're looking at the really long game here.
Exactly. And one of the pioneers in this field is Brian Skirms. And he used evolutionary game theory to show how fairness and cooperation can emerge even among individuals who are mostly self-interested.
Okay, that's interesting because wouldn't you think in a survival of the fittest world that it would be the most selfish individuals who would win out?
Right. You would think that. But it turns out that sometimes being cooperative can actually be the most successful strategy in the long run.
So how does that work?
Well, if you're interacting with the same group of people over and over again,
Right.
building a reputation for fairness and trustworthiness becomes super important.
Because if you're a jerk, nobody is going to want to work with you.
Exactly. You're going to miss out on all the benefits of collaboration. And in the long game of evolution, those who cooperate, they often end up with more resources, stronger social bonds, and better chances of survival.
So it's like what goes around comes around, but on like a evolutionary scale.
Yeah, exactly. And this has some really interesting implications for how we think about morality. It suggests that our sense of fairness and cooperation might be deeply rooted in our evolutionary past.
It's not just some abstract idea, it's like built into us.
Right, exactly. It could be shaped by those forces of natural selection over thousands of years.
That's so cool. Okay, so we've been talking about game theory in kind of a general way, but can we bring it down to earth a little bit and talk about some real-world ethical issues?
Absolutely. Game theory has been applied to all sorts of real-world problems, from nuclear deterrence to climate change.
All right, let's get into it.
So let's start with nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, game theory was actually used to analyze the strategic dynamics between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Things like MAD, mutually assured destruction, where both sides knew they could destroy each other, that was heavily influenced by these game theory models.
It's kind of terrifying to think about the fate of the world being analyzed like a game.
Yeah, it is. And that's why the ethics of nuclear deterrence has been such a huge topic for philosophers.
Mm.
Game theory can't tell us whether Maduro is right or wrong,
Right.
but it helps us understand the logic behind it.
And that's really important if we want to, like, prevent nuclear war.
Exactly. And that same idea applies to how game theory is being used to understand and hopefully address harmful social norms.
Oh, yeah, that's something I wanted to ask about. Like, we hear about things like honor killings or female genital mutilation,
Right.
but I'm not sure how game theory fits into that.
Well, it can help us understand the social pressures that keep those practices going.
Okay.
It shows how individual choices and beliefs about what others are thinking can create situations where even people who hate the norm feel like they have to go along with it.
So it's like they're trapped even if they want things to change.
Exactly. And one example of this is something called pluralistic ignorance.
Okay.
And this is where people might privately disagree with the norm, but they think everybody else supports it.
It's like being afraid to speak up, even if you think other people might agree with you.
Exactly. And game theory gives us a way to model this dynamic and even better to think about how to break out of it.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, it suggests that changing these harmful norms requires like a coordinated effort to shift everyone's beliefs and expectations at the same time.
So it's not just about convincing individuals, it's about changing the whole social context.
Exactly. It's like creating a tipping point where suddenly cooperating to change the norm becomes the best strategy for everyone.
So game theory can help us figure out how to make that happen.
That's the idea.
This has been such a mind-blowing deep dive. We've gone from these big philosophical ideas about morality to nuclear war and even how to change harmful social norms.
And it all connects back to game theory.
It really does. It's like we've been given this new way of looking at the world and seeing how our choices are all connected.
Exactly. And those connections are everywhere, from our personal relationships to global challenges like climate change.
Well, I know I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. And to all of our listeners out there, the next time you're facing a tough decision, think about the power of game theory. Think about the incentives, the consequences for everyone involved, and how even small acts of cooperation can make a difference.
Well said.
It's been a pleasure having you on this journey with us.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, keep those brain gears turning, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.